Before the case ever became a headline, Martha Stewart was already a symbol of precision. Her brand was built on the idea that details matter: how a table is set, how a recipe is measured, how a home is presented with calm control. That public image made the events of late 2001 especially striking. A story about markets, trust, and what happens when a famous name collides with strict expectations around information. To understand the situation, it helps to remember that Martha Stewart was not only a media figure. She had a background in finance earlier in her career, and she was also the leader of a public company tied closely to her personal reputation. That meant two things at once. She was comfortable around money decisions, and any controversy could instantly become larger than the underlying trade. The center of the story was a biotechnology company called ImClone Systems and a cancer drug known as Erbitux. In late 2001, the market was intensely focused on whether the company's regulatory filing would move forward smoothly. This kind of event can influence a stock price quickly because it changes expectations about future revenue and credibility. On December 28, 2001, ImClone received a refusal to file letter from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, meaning the application was not accepted for review at that time. The announcement came after the market close, and the stock fell sharply afterward. The day before that letter became public, Martha Stewart sold roughly $230,000 worth of ImClone shares. Investigators later argued that the timing mattered, not because selling stock is unusual, but because the sale appeared to occur just ahead of a major negative development. The government alleged she avoided losses of about $45,673 by selling when she did. From an educational perspective, this is where many people misunderstand insider trading stories. The core concern is not whether someone is smart or lucky. The concern is whether someone acted using important, non-public information in a way that undermines fairness. Markets depend on the belief that price moves reflect public disclosures and legitimate analysis, not private alerts moving through personal networks. As the story unfolded, the case became less about a single trade and more about explanations. What did she know? When did she know it? Why did she sell? And how did her story match the evidence investigators collected? In these cases, the trade is often only the beginning, the narrative around the trade. Emails, phone logs, statements to investigators can become just as important as the transaction itself. There was also another character at the center, her broker, Peter Bakanovich at Merrill Lynch. Investigators alleged she received an improper tip connected to what was happening inside ImClone. Separately, the SEC filed a civil complaint alleging illegal insider trading related to the December 27th sale. Yet the public lesson of Part 1 is not about celebrity, it is about vulnerability. When a person's brand is built on control, any allegation that suggests hidden advantage can feel like a direct attack on identity. That emotional pressure can shape decisions, especially decisions about what to say next. In the next part, we'll examine the crucial boundary that turns normal market research into legal risk. the difference between public color and material non-public information, and why explanations around timing can become the heart of a case. Most investors learn quickly that information is everywhere. Earnings calls, analyst reports, trade publications, product reviews, industry conferences. These are normal sources. It is also normal for investors to ask questions and form opinions. The line becomes dangerous when information is both important and not public, and when it is shared in a way that breaks a duty of trust. The Martha Stewart ImClone story is a classic example of how that line can blur in real life. On the surface, the action looks simple. A person sells shares. But regulators rarely focus on selling as a behavior. They focus on timing, context, and access. Why timing? Because timing can reveal whether a decision came from public reasoning or from something else. If the market does not yet know that a major negative event is imminent and a person sells just before that event is revealed, investigators naturally ask how that person reached their conclusion. Sometimes the answer is perfectly legitimate: risk management, portfolio rebalancing, or a long-planned decision. Other times, the answer involves private knowledge that the public did not have. ImClone's situation involved a very specific kind of sensitive update, a regulatory step that could shift expectations overnight. The SEC's public statements about the broader ImClone trading situation described how, once the negative regulatory news was learned internally, calls were made and sales were attempted or executed among people close to the company. That context mattered because it suggested the presence of a wider information flow problem, not just one isolated trade. In Martha Stewart's case, a key question became whether she acted after receiving an unlawful tip. The SEC alleged she sold after receiving a tip from her broker that was connected to the situation inside ImClone. Meanwhile, Stewart maintained she had a prior arrangement to sell if the stock fell below $60. That claim became part of the debate about why she sold and what motivated the timing. From an educational viewpoint, the most useful lesson is how quickly informal explanations can become formal evidence. A person may tell a story that feels reasonable in conversation. I had a plan. I set a trigger level. I was busy and wanted to reduce risk. But when the market event is unusually specific and when it occurs immediately after, the story is tested against records, phone messages, calendar entries, trade confirmations, assistant notes, and the sequence of who contacted whom. Another important learning point is that compliance risk is not only about the initial decision, it is also about what happens after questions appear. Many cases escalate because the response becomes defensive rather than careful. Instead of saying, "I don't remember, let's check records," people sometimes guess, simplify, or over-explain. Those instincts can backfire because investigators compare statements to documented facts. This is why training often emphasizes a calm principle. If you are uncertain, do not fill in gaps with confidence. In markets, confidence is admired. In investigations, precision is safer. The ImClone story also illustrates a reality about modern finance. Networks are powerful, but they are also traceable. Phone calls leave logs, trades leave timestamps, corporate news leaves a timeline. Investigators can align those layers. The more a person's success depends on private access, the more fragile their defense becomes when the timeline is reconstructed. In the next part, we'll follow how the case shifted from the trade itself to the statements made afterward, why the legal outcome was widely remembered not as a straightforward insider trading conviction, but as a lesson about truthfulness, process, and accountability. Many people think the Martha Stewart case is primarily an insider trading story. In reality, the most decisive legal outcomes were shaped by something else: how the situation was explained once investigators began asking questions. In high-profile financial cases, the initial trade often triggers attention, but the investigation focuses on a broader pattern. What did people say? What did they do? And how consistent were their actions with their explanations? The Martha Stewart case became widely known because the courtroom arguments centered on whether she and others misled investigators about the circumstances of the sale. After the December 27, 2001 sale of ImClone shares, the public controversy grew as regulators looked at the sequence of events surrounding the company's regulatory news. The government alleged Stewart avoided losses of about $45,673 by selling when she did. But at trial, she was not ultimately convicted of insider trading itself. Instead, a jury found her guilty on counts related to conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and making false statements to federal investigators. This is a crucial educational point. In regulated environments, the second act can be more damaging than the first. When authorities believe they are being misled, the matter becomes not only about market fairness, but also about integrity of the investigative process. That shift can increase seriousness, increase attention, and narrow the available paths to resolution. The public record of the case describes how the trial examined details such as messages, recollections, and whether the explanation about a $60 trigger reflected a genuine pre-existing plan or a narrative formed after scrutiny began. This is not unusual in such cases. Investigators and juries often weigh not only what was said, but how it aligns with surrounding facts. Was the story consistent across time? Did it change as more information surfaced? Did it match what other witnesses said? The case also demonstrates the risk of confidence under pressure. A person facing public embarrassment may try to regain control by offering a clean explanation, simple, decisive, easy to understand. But complex events rarely have simple documentation. If the simple story cannot be supported, it can create more questions than it answers. Another important lesson is that celebrity changes the environment. When the subject is famous, the investigation can become a cultural event. Media attention creates noise, and noise adds pressure. That pressure can lead to choices that prioritize public messaging over careful legal strategy. In the Martha Stewart case, the issue was not only what happened, but how it was defended publicly and privately, and how those defenses were evaluated. From the perspective of a viewer learning about ethics, this is a teachable contrast. Ethical decision-making is slow and documented. Crisis decision-making is fast and emotional. When people mix the two, they take on avoidable risk. Ultimately, Stewart was sentenced to 5 months in prison, 5 months of home confinement, and 2 years of probation for the offenses connected to the investigation narrative. The sentence became a symbol, not because it was the harshest possible outcome, but because it happened to someone who represented order and success. In the next part, we'll explore the broader market impact, how this case influenced corporate behavior, investor culture, and the way compliance teams teach information boundaries to prevent similar escalations. A market is more than a place where money moves. It is a system of shared belief. People participate because they assume that prices reflect publicly available information and honest analysis. When a story suggests that someone benefited from private alerts instead, it weakens confidence, even among people who never traded that stock. The Martha Stewart case mattered culturally because it took an abstract concept, market fairness, and attached it to a household name. Many viewers who had never followed biotech news suddenly had to grapple with the simple question: if someone famous can face serious consequences over a relatively small avoided loss, what does that say about how seriously regulators treat integrity? In educational terms, the case shows how enforcement is often about protecting the system, not only correcting one person's behavior. A single trade might not change the economy, but if many people believe that private channels decide who wins, participation declines. Long-term investment depends on trust, and trust depends on consistent rules. Another practical takeaway is the difference between what feels normal in social life and what is acceptable in professional finance. Friends share hints. Colleagues share gossip. In ordinary contexts, that may feel harmless. In markets, even a small hint can become material if it relates to a major corporate or regulatory event. ImClone's situation involved sensitive regulatory communication. Public sources describe how the company's internal awareness of the negative FDA SEP triggered a wave of calls and sales among people connected to the company. That background made any perfectly timed sale by a prominent outsider look suspicious, even if the outsider believed they had a personal explanation. The Martha Stewart story also highlights a compliance reality. When someone's professional identity includes power and competence, they may underestimate how an investigator hears their explanation. What sounds like, "I acted decisively," can be interpreted as, "I acted with certainty." And certainty invites the question, what created that certainty? This is why modern compliance training often pushes a key habit: build decisions on verifiable public inputs. If a decision depends on a private conversation, it is automatically fragile. Even if nothing improper was intended, the appearance of impropriety can become costly, especially when timing aligns too neatly with undisclosed events. There's also a leadership lesson for public company founders and executives. Personal reputation is not separate from corporate value. When Martha Stewart faced indictment, she stepped down from leadership roles at her company while remaining on the board, reflecting how legal scrutiny can force organizational change even before a final outcome. The market often reacts not only to legal facts, but to uncertainty itself. For audiences watching today, the deeper message is simple and calm. Shortcuts are rarely worth their hidden costs. Even when a dollar amount is not enormous, the reputational cost can be immense. Careers are long. Trust is slow to build and quick to damage. In the next part, we'll move from what happened to what it changed, how this case shaped policies, how it influenced civil outcomes with regulators, and what practical guardrails organizations use to keep information risk from turning into legal risk. Criminal trials are only one lane of accountability. In many market cases, civil enforcement continues on a separate track, focusing on investor protection, penalties, and restrictions designed to discourage similar behavior. The Martha Stewart story illustrates how these tracks can unfold over time. After the criminal outcome, the SEC continued pursuing the matter in civil court. In 2006, Martha Stewart and Peter Bogdanovich reached a settlement with the SEC regarding insider trading allegations tied to the December 2001 sale. Under the settlement terms announced by the SEC, Stewart agreed to an injunction, disgorgement of the losses she avoided, and a civil penalty of 3 times the avoided loss, totaling about $195,000 in monetary relief. From an educational standpoint, this civil resolution teaches an important point. Even when a criminal case is resolved, regulators may still seek remedies that reinforce market standards. Civil penalties are not only about punishment, they are about restoring fairness and setting a public example of consequences. The case also became a textbook moment for compliance teams. It highlighted several weak points that organizations now try to strengthen. First, documentation culture. When a trade is questioned, a clear paper trail matters. If a person claims a standing plan or a preset trigger, compliance teams want that plan recorded in advance, not reconstructed later. Written policies, pre-clearance processes, and dated notes reduce ambiguity. Second, communication hygiene. Compliance departments teach employees to avoid receiving specific internal updates from corporate contacts and to stop conversations that drift into sensitive territory. The goal is not to punish networking, but to prevent accidental exposure to restricted information. Third, role clarity. Many risk events occur when social relationships overlap with professional authority. The case showed how quickly a relationship chain, executive to broker to investor, can become a focus of scrutiny when confidential news is moving inside a company. Fourth, crisis discipline. When questions arise, the safest approach is calm and precise. Gather records, consult counsel, and avoid speculation. The Martha Stewart case is remembered in part because the legal findings centered on obstruction and false statements. The educational takeaway is that in regulated environments, how you respond to scrutiny can be as important as the original event. Over the years, the case also affected the public understanding of insider trading. Many viewers learned for the first time that markets are policed not only through dramatic confessions, but through timelines, communication records, and consistency checks. That awareness helped shift expectations. Finance is competitive, but it is not a free-for-all. In the next and final part, we'll zoom out to the long-term legacy, how Martha Stewart rebuilt her public life, why the case still appears in ethics training, and how the simplest rule of market integrity remains the most powerful. If information is not public, your advantage should come from analysis, not access. The final chapter of the Martha Stewart insider trading saga is not only about a court verdict or a settlement. It is about how a public figure, a company, and an industry processed a moment that challenged trust. For Martha Stewart, the outcome created a rare kind of public test. Her brand stood for reliability and control, yet the case placed her in a story defined by uncertainty, scrutiny, and legal judgment. She served a sentence of 5 months in prison and 5 months of home confinement, followed by probation. In parallel, she later settled the SEC's civil case with monetary relief of about $195,000 tied to avoided losses and penalties. From an educational viewpoint, what matters most is not the spectacle of fame meeting enforcement. What matters is what the case continues to teach about market integrity. First, it shows that scale is not the only factor. The alleged avoided loss was not enormous by Wall Street standards, yet the consequences were serious. That demonstrates how strongly regulators and courts can treat honesty in investigations and fairness in markets. The lesson is simple. Markets cannot function if rules apply only to some people. Second, it highlights the concept of reputation as an asset. In business, reputation is often more valuable than a single trade. Once damaged, it requires sustained effort to rebuild. This is why many compliance programs treat ethical habits as strategic, not merely moral. They protect the long-term ability to lead, partner, and operate without constant doubt. Third, it reinforces the idea that clarity prevents escalation. When people plan trades using clear, documented processes, they reduce risk. When they rely on informal arrangements, unwritten triggers, or ambiguous memory, they increase vulnerability when questioned. Compliance is, in many ways, the discipline of reducing ambiguity before it becomes expensive. Finally, the case remains relevant because the underlying temptation never disappears. Markets will always reward being early, but the clean way to be early is to be early through public signals, deep research, careful modeling, and patient reasoning, not through private updates that were never meant to guide trading. That is the enduring legacy of this story. The strongest edge is the one you can explain openly, calmly, and confidently, without needing a private conversation to make it work.